The camera sweeps low over Carlisle Bay, where the Caribbean meets coral white cliffs that glow in the afternoon sun. This is Barbados, or as the Kalinago people knew it, Ichiruganayim, meaning red land or land with red clay. It sits in the eastern Caribbean, part of the Lesser Antilles, squeezed between St. Lucia to the west and Trinidad to the south. A flat limestone island that the British would later nickname Little England, though the original inhabitants might have had other names for it. In 1657, Governor Daniel Searle sent a report back to London describing the island's remarkable productivity. Remarkable, of course, because he was counting sugar profits, not the human cost of producing them. The Europeans loved to talk about discovering places that every regional sailor from the Orinoco to the Windward Islands already knew existed. Classic colonial logic. If English people don't live there yet, it's apparently available. These beaches are undeniably beautiful. The history that unfolded here? Considerably less so. But somewhere in the interior, past the cane fields that would later carpet the island, an old tamarind tree marked the boundary of something the colonizers never fully understood: the quiet, persistent rhythm of resistance that would pulse through centuries. A world existed here long before any European ship appeared on the horizon. Around 1200 CE, Kalinago navigators had already established sophisticated trade networks throughout the Caribbean, moving between islands with the kind of maritime knowledge that would take Europeans centuries to match. On Ichiruganayim, communities near present-day St. Lucie Parish cultivated cassava, using horticultural techniques refined over generations. They built fishing weirs in the shallows, designed to trap fish during tidal changes with an engineering precision that spoke to generations of accumulated knowledge. The pottery they crafted in the Saladoid tradition wasn't simply functional. It carried artistic traditions, geometric patterns that connected them to broader cultural networks stretching from the Orinoco Basin through the Lesser Antilles. Women processed cassava, using techniques that removed toxic compounds, transforming a poisonous root into nutritious bread. Men navigated between islands using star patterns, current knowledge, and bird behavior. Archaeological records show settlements with organized social structures, evidence of long-distance trade in tools and ceremonial objects, and ceramic traditions that spoke to cultural continuity spanning centuries. When Spanish explorers made their 16th-century references to these islands, they were documenting societies that had been functioning, adapting, and thriving for far longer than Spain had been a unified kingdom. The unnamed makers of those pottery fragments found in St. Lucie weren't primitive. They were expert craftspeople operating within a complex cultural framework that balanced resource management, artistic expression, and community organization. This wasn't an empty land waiting for civilization. This was Ichiruganayim, inhabited, connected, and complete unto itself. Then Spain showed up with big flags and even bigger entitlement. In 1536, Portuguese navigator Pedro Campos sailed past Barbados and promptly claimed to have discovered it, despite the inconvenient presence of people who already lived there. The Portuguese used the island as a rest stop, nothing more. They were busy elsewhere in the Americas, focused on Brazil and the more obviously profitable mainland territories. But in 1625, the English arrived under Captain John Powell, and unlike the Portuguese, they came with paperwork and plans. Powell claimed the island for King James I, initiating what the English records cheerfully described as a settlement opportunity. The motives were straightforward at first. The island served as a rest stop for ships crossing the Atlantic, a place to take on fresh water and make repairs. But within months, the English were surveying land, drawing boundaries, and distributing property grants. The landing records from 1625 are remarkably casual about displacing an entire existing world. What happened to the indigenous population remains partly obscured by incomplete colonial documentation. Some oral traditions suggest forced removal to other islands, others disease epidemics accelerated by contact, others deliberate violence designed to clear the land. What's documented with certainty is the speed of erasure. Within a single generation, the Kalinago presence had been systematically eliminated from English administrative records, as though an entire people had simply vanished. By 1650, English documents referred to Barbados as having been uninhabited before their arrival, a historical revision so brazen it would be impressive if it weren't so devastating. Contact between indigenous people and Europeans was brief in the historical timeline, measured in decades rather than centuries. But the consequences would stretch across centuries, reshaping everything that came after Enter the English, with lawyers and land deeds and a remarkable ability to ignore inconvenient previous inhabitants. By 1627, the English had established a formal settlement at Holetown in St. James Parish, and the mechanism of colonial control began grinding into motion. The settlement was led by merchant investors from London, who saw Barbados as a speculative opportunity. What they called planting a colony looked suspiciously like organized land theft, but the paperwork made it legal in English eyes. Land grants were distributed to settlers who had never seen the island, carved up on maps in London offices, and handed out to anyone with sufficient capital or connections. The entire operation rested on a logic so circular, it would be funny if it weren't so destructive. Empty land justified taking it, and land was empty if English people didn't live there yet. So any land with non-English people was considered available for claiming. Within a year, the settlement at Holetown had established basic infrastructure: a fort, a church, warehouses, and residential structures for the planters. The empire had arrived with lawyers, surveyors, and an unshakable conviction that possession was 9/10 of the law. The early English settlers tried tobacco first, attempting to replicate Virginia's profitable model. It didn't work. Barbados tobacco couldn't compete with mainland varieties in quality, and the small island couldn't match Virginia's scale. Cotton was attempted next, with similarly disappointing results. For nearly 2 decades, Barbados remained a minor colonial backwater, profitable enough to sustain but not wealthy enough to attract major investment. But in the 1640s, everything changed when Sephardic Jews fleeing persecution in Dutch Brazil arrived with sugar cultivation expertise and processing knowledge that had been refined in the Brazilian plantations. Planters like James Drax and Henry Hawley saw the profit potential immediately. Drax traveled to Brazil specifically to learn sugar production techniques, then returned and began converting his estates. By 1643, the first successful sugar crop was processed on the island. Within a decade, sugar had transformed Barbados from a struggling colony into one of England's most valuable overseas possessions. Mills appeared across the landscape. First wind-powered structures, then water-powered operations along the island's limited streams. Forests were cleared systematically. Hardwood trees felled to provide timber for construction and fuel for the boiling houses. Watercourses were redirected to power the crushing machinery that processed cane. Estate ledgers from the 1640s document the rapid transformation with clinical precision. Acres cleared, mills constructed, hogsheads of sugar produced, profits projected in pounds sterling. What those ledgers didn't emphasize, though the numbers were there if you looked, was that this entire enterprise required massive amounts of labor under brutal conditions. Sugar cultivation was backbreaking work, cutting cane in tropical heat, loading it onto carts, feeding it into crushing mills, boiling the juice in massive cauldrons, clarifying the syrup, allowing it to crystallize. Every step required human labor, and the profit margins demanded that labor be as cheap as possible. Sugar minted fortunes for the planter class in a single generation. Men who arrived with modest capital became wealthy enough to purchase country estates in England within a decade, and it required a labor force built on systematized violence. The question wasn't whether to use enslaved labor. The question was how many people could be worked to death before the math stopped making economic sense. And guess who did the work? Captive Africans began arriving in large numbers starting in the 1640s, forcibly transported from Senegambia, the Gold Coast, and the Bight of Biafra, in conditions so horrific that roughly 15% died during the Middle Passage. They came as property in English law, but they arrived as human beings with knowledge, languages, and cultures the planters systematically tried to erase. By 1650, there were roughly 6,000 enslaved Africans on Barbados. By 1680, that number had exploded to over 38,000, outnumbering white colonists by more than 2 to 1. The work was relentless and dangerous, cutting cane in tropical heat for 12 to 16 hours per day during harvest season, feeding the crushing mills where a moment's inattention could cost you an arm, working the boiling houses where sugar was processed in massive iron cauldrons that could easily kill you if you slipped or were pushed, clearing ash pits filled with toxic residue, and then starting again before dawn the next day. A 1674 plantation report from St. George Parish references an enslaved man named Cuffy serving as a driver, forced to manage other enslaved workers, caught in the impossible position of survival through compliance with a system designed to brutalize everyone it touched. The psychological torture of the driver position was deliberate. Enslavers used it to create divisions and prevent unified resistance. Cultural preservation became an act of resistance from the moment of arrival. Drum rhythms were muted by laws that prohibited African instruments, terrified that communication meant conspiracy. Family networks formed in secret, maintaining kinship ties despite the constant threat of separation through sale names were changed by enslavers, African names replaced with European ones or crude nicknames. But people remembered their real names and passed them down in whispered conversations. Languages were banned on many plantations, but survived in fragments, rhythms embedded in work songs, coded phrases that looked like compliance but carried other meanings. Religious practices from West Africa were maintained in modified forms, blending with Christianity when necessary for survival, but retaining deeper spiritual frameworks. Human beings built this economy, brick by brick, cane stalk by cane stalk, barrel by barrel, while the people who profited pretended they didn't notice that enslaved people were, in fact, people with families and dreams and an entirely reasonable desire not to be worked to death for someone else's profit. And resistance? It started immediately in ways both large and small, visible and invisible. In 1661, Barbados formalized its system of racial oppression with a comprehensive slave code, crafted under Governor Lord Willoughby and passed by the Colonial Assembly. The Barbados Slave Code became the foundational template for English slave law throughout the Caribbean, and eventually influenced codes in South Carolina, Virginia, and other mainland colonies. The actual clauses are chilling in their bureaucratic precision and systematic dehumanization. Enslaved people were defined as chattel property, equivalent to livestock or furniture, and denied any legal personhood. They could not own property, testify in court against white people, or travel without written passes. Masters could punish however they chose, and the code explicitly protected them from prosecution for any injuries or deaths resulting from moderate correction. Running away could result in nose slitting for first offense, branding for second offense, and execution for third offense. Striking a white person, regardless of provocation, was punishable by death. The code permitted whipping, confinement in stocks, starvation as punishment, and mutilation as deterrent. Enslaved people could not gather in groups larger than 3 without white supervision. They could not carry weapons. They could not learn to read or write. They could not practice traditional religions. The code even regulated clothing and movement, ensuring that enslaved status was visible and inescapable. This wasn't anomalous cruelty by a few sadistic individuals. This was law, carefully debated by the colonial assembly, written down in formal legal language, and enforced by courts and militias. The psychological reality of living under such a system is almost impossible to articulate. Every morning you woke knowing that legally you were equivalent to livestock. Every interaction with white people carried the potential for lethal violence with no legal recourse whatsoever. You could be sold away from your children at any moment. You could be whipped for working too slowly. You could be killed for defending yourself. When laws are this comprehensively evil, when the entire legal structure exists to maintain violence, resistance isn't just likely. It's inevitable. Anyone who could find a way out would take it, and anyone who couldn't escape physically would resist in whatever small ways were possible. Cue the hills, the hidden gullies, and the quiet, determined defiance that would never fully stop. Between 1680 and 1780, everyday resistance became a constant feature of Barbadian plantation life, so pervasive that planters simply budgeted for it. As a cost of doing business, sabotage happened regularly. Tools accidentally broken at rates that couldn't possibly be accidental. Work performed slowly in coordinated fashion across entire work gangs. Cane fires of mysterious origin that destroyed thousands of pounds worth of crop. Some people escaped to the interior, using the island's geography, limited though it was compared to Jamaica or Suriname, to evade recapture. The Scotland District's limestone ridges and St. Andrew's gullies provided temporary refuge for runaways. A 1701 report documented habitual runaways who repeatedly fled despite punishments that included whipping, branding, and confinement in chains. Some people were listed as runaways for years, suggesting they had found ways to survive outside the plantation system through a combination of hiding, theft, and support from enslaved people still on plantations. Coastal areas offered another escape route. Some enslaved people stole boats at night and attempted to reach other islands, particularly French-controlled Martinique or St. Lucia, hoping that jurisdictional boundaries might offer a chance at freedom or at least different masters. The parish geography mattered enormously to resistance strategies. While Barbados lacked the massive mountain ranges of Jamaica or the dense rainforests of Suriname, people still found places to hide. Abandoned plantation sites in St. Philip, limestone caves in Christchurch, thick vegetation in the gullies that cut through the coral limestone plateau. The paperwork rarely captures the full scope of resistance because planters had strong incentive to minimize reports. Acknowledging widespread rebellion made the entire system look unstable and reduced property values when estates were sold. But the complaints in overseer letters and the persistent laws against harboring runaways tell the real story. Colony-wide laws were passed in 1688, 1708, and 1739 specifically to address runaways, suggesting the problem was continuous and unsolvable. They fought in ways the official records barely document, but the fight was constant, creative, and costly to the plantation system. and it was about to become much more public and coordinated. Barbados may not have towering mountains, but rebellion doesn't require dramatic elevation. It requires motivation, organization, and intimate knowledge of the land. By the 1700s, enslaved people had mapped the island's hidden possibilities with the kind of precision that came from decades of quiet observation. The gully systems cutting through the coral limestone created natural corridors for movement outside the main roads where patrols traveled. Abandoned mill sites from failed plantations provided temporary shelter, offering walls and roofs far from current operations. Plantation letters from the 1730s complain about maroon bands. The term applied loosely to anyone who escaped and survived outside the plantation system, even temporarily. Overseers wrote frustrated reports about workers who vanished for days or weeks, then reappeared with no explanation of where they'd been or how they'd survived. Some planters suspected underground networks of support, enslaved people on functioning plantations providing food and information to runaways in exchange for news from other estates. The geography of rebellion wasn't about dramatic peaks and impenetrable forests. It was about knowing where the patrols didn't go, which plantations had sympathetic workers, where fresh water could be found in dry season, which caves offered shelter during storms, and how to move at night using the stars and familiar landmarks. Rebellion doesn't need mountains, just motivation and intimate knowledge of terrain that looks flat to outsiders, but reveals itself as complex to anyone who pays attention. And then came Busa, and with him, the largest organized rebellion Barbados had ever seen. In April 1816, enslaved people across multiple parishes coordinated an uprising that would shake the colony to its foundations and reverberate through the entire British Caribbean. The rebellion was led by Busa, an African-born enslaved man working at Bailey's plantation in St. Philip Parish, who had likely been a chief or warrior in Africa before his enslavement. Alongside him were Ranger Washington Franklin, whose job required him to move between plantations carrying messages, making him perfect for coordinating resistance, and Nanny Grigg, a midwife and enslaved woman from the Simmons plantation, whose position allowed her to travel between estates, attending births, and gathering intelligence without immediate suspicion. Nanny Grigg had heard rumors of emancipation being discussed in the British Parliament and spread word that freedom had already been granted, but was being withheld by local planters. The plan was sophisticated and demonstrated months of preparation. Synchronized fires across multiple estates to create chaos and draw militia forces out of position, seizure of weapons from plantation armories, and coordinated movement toward Bridgetown to take the colonial capital. The rebellion began on Easter Sunday, April 14, 1816, when roughly 400 enslaved people rose simultaneously across St. Philip Parish, setting fire to cane fields and fighting militia forces with machetes, stolen muskets, and anything else they could use as weapons. The fires lit up the night sky, visible from Bridgetown 10 miles away, and created immediate panic throughout the white population. The Colonial Committee report from 1816 documented the British response. Militia mobilized within hours, martial law declared across the island, and brutal suppression followed. British troops hunted rebels through the cane fields and gullies, killing anyone who resisted. Busa himself was killed in battle near Bailey's plantation, shot while fighting militia forces. Approximately 50 enslaved people died fighting. Another 70 were executed in the immediate aftermath through drumhead courts-martial, and over 100 more were transported off the island as punishment, sold to other colonies as a way of breaking up the resistance network. The rebellion lasted only 3 days before being suppressed, but those 3 days terrified the planter class more than any event since colonization. The rebellion failed to overthrow the system, but it succeeded in demonstrating that enslaved people were capable of organized resistance on a scale the planters had feared, but hoped would never materialize. They weren't fighting chaos or random violence. They were fighting for a future they knew they deserved, one where their children wouldn't be property. The rebellion's impact would echo across the Caribbean, contributing to the growing pressure on the British government to reconsider the entire institution of slavery. In Barbados today, Busa is a national hero, and his statue stands at the center of the Emancipation Roundabout, sword raised toward the sky. News traveled through the Caribbean faster than most colonizers realized, carried by sailors, free people of color who moved between islands for trade, and enslaved people who worked on ships and in ports. By the early 19th century. The Haitian Revolution's success, enslaved people overthrowing their masters and establishing the first Black Republic in the Americas, circulated through these informal networks like electricity through water. Plantation owners lived in constant fear of French Negroes' ideas contaminating their labor force, which was their way of saying they were terrified that enslaved people might realize successful rebellion was possible. Letters from 1815 to 1820 show planters obsessively discussing how to prevent information about Haiti from reaching enslaved populations, which was a bit like trying to prevent water from being wet, impossible and somewhat absurd. Planters demanded censorship of newspapers, interrogation of sailors arriving from French islands, and restrictions on travel for free people of color. It didn't work. In 1823, the Demerara Rebellion in British Guiana sent another shockwave through the colonial establishment. Over 10,000 enslaved people rose up across the colony, and while the rebellion was suppressed with extreme violence, the scale terrified planters across every British Caribbean colony. If it could happen in Demerara, it could happen anywhere. Ideas travel faster than ships, and by the 1820s, the idea that slavery could end, and that enslaved people might be the ones to end it, had become undeniable. The pressure on the British government mounted from multiple directions simultaneously. Abolitionist movements in Britain gaining political power, economic shifts making slavery less profitable as industrialization changed labor markets, and the persistent threat of more rebellions that might actually succeed. Parliament couldn't ignore the combination of moral pressure, economic calculation, and fear of widespread uprising. Emancipation was coming, but not honestly or generously or with any real concern for the people who had been enslaved. On August 1st, 1834, the British Parliament officially abolished slavery in its colonies, and approximately 83,000 enslaved people in Barbados were legally freed. Except they weren't. Not really. The Emancipation Act included a mandatory apprenticeship period lasting 4 to 6 years, depending on whether you'd been classified as a field worker or a domestic servant. The apprenticeship system forced formerly enslaved people to continue working for their former enslavers without wages for 45 hours per week, supposedly to transition both parties to free labor and teach the formerly enslaved how to handle freedom. The condescension was breathtaking. Testimony from St. John Parish records reveals the apprenticeship system as slavery with better branding and paperwork. Same brutal hours, same corporal punishment for perceived infractions, same lack of autonomy over your own time or body. One woman named Sarah testified that her free children were still forced to work in the fields without compensation, and when she protested, she was whipped by the same overseer who had whipped her under slavery. Another man testified that apprentices could still be sold away from their families, just under different legal language. The fine print was extensive and deliberately cruel, designed to maintain plantation profits while giving Britain the moral satisfaction of ending slavery. Freedom finally arrived on paper August 1st, 1838, when apprenticeship officially ended after sustained protest from both free black people and British abolitionists who recognized apprenticeship as a cynical fraud. But even full legal freedom didn't mean economic freedom. The plantation economy immediately restructured to maintain control through wages so low they barely sustained survival. Freedom with fine print isn't freedom. It's just a different kind of trap with slightly better marketing. After full emancipation in 1838, the plantation system didn't collapse or even significantly weaken. It evolved into new forms of exploitation. Wages were kept deliberately low through planter collusion, ensuring that newly freed people had almost no economic mobility or bargaining power. A field worker might earn a few pence per day, barely enough for food and basic clothing. Plantation consolidation continued as smaller estates were absorbed into larger operations, concentrating wealth and power in fewer hands. Some free villages emerged where people could buy small plots of land through collective savings, creating spaces of relative autonomy and community control. Places like St. James and Christ Church saw the development of these villages, where formerly enslaved people built houses, cultivated kitchen gardens, and created the beginnings of an independent black peasantry. But most people remained economically tied to plantation labor by necessity. Land was expensive, alternative employment scarce, and the planters still controlled almost all economic infrastructure. Starting in the 1840s, small numbers of indentured workers arrived from Madeira, brought in by planters who wanted additional labor and hoped Portuguese workers might undercut wages and reduce the bargaining power of the black labor force. Later, in the 1860s and 1870s, small groups of Indian indentured workers arrived, though Barbados received far fewer than Trinidad or British Guiana, because the existing black labor force was sufficient for the island's needs. Immigration records from the late 1800s document these arrivals. Several hundred Portuguese, about 500 Indians, numbers that supplemented but didn't replace the existing workforce. The plantation economy had simply reloaded its extraction mechanisms with new legal frameworks, replacing chattel slavery with wage labor that paid barely enough to survive. The exploitation continued in modified form. Only the justifications changed. And when wages are poverty wages and land ownership is systematically blocked through economic and legal mechanisms, calling it freedom rings hollow. People understood this perfectly well, which is why the next phase involved riots, union organization, and increasingly militant political demands. On July 26, 1937, everything erupted in Bridgetown. Clement Payne, a Trinidadian-born labor activist of Barbadian descent, arrived in Barbados and began organizing workers, giving speeches about labor rights, fair wages, and the need for collective action against plantation owners. His speeches drew hundreds of workers in Bridgetown and St. Michael Parish, electrifying a labor movement that had been building momentum for years. The colonial government, recognizing the threat, moved quickly. They arrested Payne and ordered him deported back to Trinidad within a week of his arrival. The deportation was scheduled for July 26th, and when police attempted to remove him from the island, workers exploded into the streets. The 1937 riots weren't random violence. They were targeted protest against decades of exploitation, low wages, poor working conditions, and the plantation system's refusal to change. Workers in Bridgetown confronted police, set fires in commercial districts, and marched through the streets demanding Payne's release and economic justice. The riots spread beyond Bridgetown into surrounding parishes, lasting several days. 14 people died, most shot by police attempting to restore order, and over 500 were arrested. But the uprising forced the British government to pay attention in ways they'd successfully avoided for decades. The resulting Moyne Commission was dispatched to investigate labor conditions throughout the British Caribbean, and their report, published in 1939, documented conditions so appalling that the British government suppressed the full findings until after World War II, fearing they would damage wartime morale and provide propaganda material to enemies. The report confirmed everything workers had been saying for generations. Poverty was widespread and systematic. Wages were unconscionably low. Housing was inadequate and often dangerous. Healthcare was almost non-existent for working people. Education was limited and underfunded, and the colonial system existed primarily to extract wealth while providing almost nothing in return. The riots catalyzed labor movements and political organization across Barbados. Unions gained legal recognition and legitimacy. Political parties formed around labor issues. People demanded dignity, and they demanded it loudly enough that ignoring them became impossible. Independence was now inevitable, just a matter of timing and negotiation. On November 30th, 1966, Barbados became an independent nation within the British Commonwealth, with Errol Barrow of the Democratic Labour Party serving as the first Prime Minister. The transition was relatively peaceful compared to other decolonization movements that had involved armed struggle or prolonged conflict. But independence was the culmination of centuries of resistance in various forms. From Kalinago resistance to colonial intrusion, through enslaved rebellions like Busa's uprising, post-emancipation labor organizing, the 1937 riots, and finally sustained political mobilization through the democratic process. The lowering of the British flag and raising of the new Barbadian flag, blue with a black trident symbolizing independence, marked a symbolic break from centuries of colonial rule. The parish system established during colonization persisted into independence as administrative divisions, but their meaning shifted from instruments of plantation control to units of local government. St. Philip, where Busa had launched his rebellion, became a site of national memory and pride. St. Michael, where the 1937 riots erupted, evolved into the political and commercial center of the new nation. Independence meant Barbados could finally define itself on its own terms, not as Little England or as a sugar colony, but as a Caribbean nation with a complex history of resistance, survival, and cultural creation. The work of building a post-colonial nation continued through the following decades, grappling with economic challenges including dependence on sugar exports and tourism, addressing educational inequalities, managing relationships with former colonial powers, and dealing with the long shadow of plantation economy structures that persisted in land ownership patterns and wealth distribution. In 2021, Barbados took another significant step by becoming a republic, removing the British monarch as head of state and installing a Barbadian president, further asserting sovereignty and self-determination. The transition happened on November 30th, the 55th anniversary of independence, and represented another phase in the long journey from Ichiruganaim to full sovereignty. The land remembers every phase: indigenous autonomy before contact, colonial violence and extraction, enslaved resistance in cane fields and gullies, emancipation struggles, labor movements that demanded dignity and independence earned through generations of persistence. And so do its people, carrying forward the drumbeat that never quite stopped, that echoed through hidden gullies and cane fields and city streets across centuries. The rhythm of people who refused to disappear, who survived and resisted and built something new from the wreckage of empire.